Before you continue, remember, this is not just another crime story. It's the moment when America's greatest hero fell from the sky into tragedy. In 1932, Charles Lindbergh, the man who conquered the Atlantic, faced the unthinkable. His 20-month-old son vanished from their home in the night. What followed would change U.S. law, ignite a media frenzy, and expose the dark side of fame. Subscribe, stay with us until the end, and let's uncover how one of the most adored men in the world became the face of a national nightmare. March 1st, 1932. The Lindbergh estate in Hopewell, New Jersey, stood isolated among quiet hills and leafless trees. Inside, the house was filled with the soft hum of domestic life. Dinner plates clinking, faint conversation between Charles Lindbergh, the nation's most famous aviator, and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, daughter of a U.S. ambassador. Upstairs, their baby, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., barely 20 months old, slept soundly in his small white crib. Around 9:30 p.m., the baby's nurse, Betty Gow, climbed the stairs to check on him. What she found would forever shatter the Lindbergh family and the country. The crib was empty. A chilling draft swept through the room. The window was open. Below it, a crude wooden ladder leaned against the wall, half buried in the mud. On the radiator, an envelope, sealed, handwritten, marked with strange looping symbols. Anne screamed. Lindbergh rushed in, still in his evening clothes, his face pale. He tore open the note. A ransom demand for $50,000, promising the child's safe return. The language was broken. "We warn you for make any ding publicity or police. The child is in good care." The threat was unmistakable. Within minutes, Lindbergh's home became chaos. Neighbors arrived. Reporters, drawn by whispers of the unthinkable, soon followed. When New Jersey police arrived, they found the crime scene already contaminated. Footprints trampled, the ladder moved, clues lost forever in the frenzy. Charles Lindbergh, accustomed to control, took command. He gave orders, directed search parties, and telephoned political contacts. He was calm, almost unnaturally so, as though trying to will order into the nightmare. Meanwhile, the press turned the home into a circus. Photographers flashed cameras at windows. Strangers shouted prayers through the gates. The entire nation now lived inside the Lindbergh's grief. The next morning, the headline screamed, "America's baby stolen from his crib." Churches rang bells. Citizens sent money, letters, and even psychic tips. Lindbergh, the man who had symbolized courage and progress, now faced a cruel paradox. The hero who could cross an ocean but not protect his own child. In those first desperate hours, no one could imagine that the baby's body already lay lifeless in the cold woods, not far from home. And as investigators fumbled through clues, a storm of deception, ransom notes, and false hope was just beginning to rise. By dawn, March 2nd, 1932, Hopewell was no longer a quiet New Jersey town. It was the epicenter of a national obsession. Hundreds of police officers, federal agents, and volunteers surrounded the Lindbergh estate. Search dogs combed the frozen woods, while reporters battled for photographs through the iron gates. Inside, Charles Lindbergh sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of telegrams and maps, his hands trembling slightly as he reread the ransom note. It wasn't just the bad grammar or the strange German-influenced phrasing that bothered investigators. It was the symbol at the bottom. 2 interlocking blue circles with 3 small holes punched through the paper. A signature, perhaps. A mark meant to terrify. Within days, new notes arrived. Each one carried the same signature and the same cold tone. The kidnappers demanded the ransom be paid in untraceable bills, warning Lindbergh not to contact the police. But the world already knew. Every radio, every newspaper, every cafe spoke of the Lindbergh baby. The pressure mounted. Out of desperation, Lindbergh turned to an unlikely ally, Dr. John F. Condon, a retired Bronx schoolteacher who publicly offered to act as an intermediary. Calling himself Jafsy, Condon published an open letter in the Bronx Home News, promising to deliver the money if the kidnappers would talk to him directly. To everyone's astonishment, they answered. A new note arrived, this time addressed to Jaffe. It contained precise instructions: where to go, how to recognize the signal, when to bring the money. Lindbergh and Condon decided to play along. On a cold night in mid-March, Condon followed the directions to a desolate Bronx cemetery. There, under the pale moonlight, a man stepped from the shadows. He wore a fedora pulled low and spoke with a heavy German accent. His name, he said, was John. Condon never saw his face clearly. The conversation was brief and haunting. "Is baby alive?" Condon asked. "Yes," the man replied. "Safe. When will we see him?" "After money paid." Condon handed over $50,000 in marked bills, packed in small denominations. John vanished into the dark, promising that the baby would be returned within a few days. But days turned into weeks. No child, no word, just silence, and growing suspicion that Lindbergh himself had been deceived. When the ransom bills began surfacing months later, investigators traced them through gas stations, groceries, and banks across New York. Each one drew the circle closer around a single suspect, a man who claimed he'd never been involved, yet kept spending the ransom money as if it were his own. The world's most famous man was about to face the most shocking twist of his life. Spring crept slowly across New Jersey in 1932, bringing rain, mud, and the unbearable passage of time. It had been more than 2 months since the Lindbergh baby disappeared. The ransom had been paid. The promises had been broken. America was still holding its breath, waiting for a miracle that would never come. Then, on May 12th, a truck driver named William Allen pulled his vehicle to the side of a quiet country road, just 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He stepped out to relieve himself near the edge of a thicket. That's when he saw it, a small white blanket tangled in roots, and beneath it, what looked like a tiny arm. Police rushed to the scene. The smell of decay filled the air. Lying face down among the wet leaves was the body of a child, decomposed, broken, and partly eaten by animals. The skull showed a fracture above the right temple. One leg had been severed. Even hardened detectives turned away in silence. Identification came quickly. Pinned to the clothing was the baby's monogram, CAL. There was no doubt. It was Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. The discovery shattered whatever hope the Lindberghs had clung to. Anne collapsed in grief. Charles, stoic as always, simply said, "Anne, our baby is gone." Then he walked outside, staring into the endless grey of the New Jersey woods. For investigators, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. If the baby had been dead since the night of the kidnapping, who had written the ransom notes, and where had the money gone? Autopsy results suggested the child had been killed almost immediately after being taken. The skull fracture was likely caused by a blow or a fall, perhaps an accident during the climb down the ladder, but others believed something darker had occurred, a deliberate murder covered by a web of deception. Public grief turned to outrage. The headlines screamed betrayal, vengeance, and failure. Nation's baby found slain. Authorities promised justice. The hunt for the killer became a crusade. Governor Harry Moore placed a $25,000 reward on the culprit's head. Every police department in the Northeast joined the chase, while the newly formed FBI began cataloging every ransom bill, every fingerprint, every whispered lead. Meanwhile, rumors swirled. Some claimed the family was hiding something. Others whispered of organized gangs, bootleggers, or foreign spies. But among the chaos, one quiet piece of evidence, a wooden ladder crudely made yet ingeniously designed, would soon lead investigators to a humble carpenter in the Bronx, a man whose life would end in the electric chair and whose guilt would forever be debated. The world had mourned the baby. Now it demanded blood. The discovery of the child's body turned the investigation into a manhunt. Thousands of agents scoured the eastern seaboard, following the trail of ransom bills that had begun resurfacing in banks and gas stations from New York to Philadelphia. Every bill was marked and logged, a silent breadcrumb pointing toward someone who had dared to profit from America's grief. In September 1934, 2 years after the kidnapping, A $10 gold certificate appeared at a Bronx service station. The attendant noticed its serial number matched the Lindbergh list. He also noticed the customer driving away in a 1930 Dodge sedan, its license plate carefully written down. That plate led police straight to Richard Hauptmann, a 35-year-old German immigrant carpenter, husband and father. When detectives raided Hauptmann's modest home, they expected little. What they found stunned them. Over $14,000 of the missing ransom money hidden in the garage rafters, carefully wrapped in brown paper. Next to it, tools that matched the unique nail holes and wood grain of the homemade ladder found at the Lindbergh estate. Within hours, newspapers screamed, "Lindbergh kidnapper caught." Hauptmann denied everything. He claimed a former friend named Isidor Fisch had left the money with him before dying in Germany. The ladder wood? Left over from his carpentry jobs. His handwriting? A coincidence. But investigators saw the perfect villain. Foreign-born, secretive, and conveniently alone. Under harsh interrogation, Hauptmann refused to confess. Reporters described him as cold as ice, staring straight ahead while questioned about the murdered child. His stoicism only fueled public anger. America demanded justice, or vengeance, and politicians promised both. By the time the trial began in January 1935, the courtroom in Flemington, New Jersey, resembled a movie set. Over 600 reporters filled the galleries. Cameras flashed incessantly. Vendors sold sandwiches, programs, and even miniature ladders to tourists. It was called the trial of the century. The prosecution painted a damning portrait. Hauptmann, as the greedy immigrant who built the ladder, climbed into the Lindbergh nursery and killed the baby. They paraded handwriting experts, wood specialists, and neighbors who swore he had lived beyond his means. Each detail tightened the noose. The defense fought desperately. They argued the police had tampered with evidence, that the ladder analysis was flawed, and that Lindbergh's celebrity had corrupted justice itself. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict had been written long before the juries. After 11 weeks, the gavel fell. Richard Hauptmann was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair. When asked for final words, he whispered, "I am absolutely innocent." To millions, his execution in April 1936 was closure. To others, it was an execution of truth itself, the sacrifice of one man to calm a furious nation. By the time Richard Hauptmann went on trial in January 1935, America was no longer seeking truth. It was seeking redemption. The grief that had gripped the nation had hardened into rage, and that rage needed a face. For the newspapers, politicians, and the grieving Lindberghs, Hauptmann was perfect. Flemington, New Jersey, became the stage for a national spectacle. Thousands gathered outside the courthouse daily, waving signs that read, "Hang the baby killer." Inside, journalists filled every corner. Radio reporters narrated each witness like it was a boxing match. It wasn't just a trial. It was the first true media circus in American history. Charles Lindbergh, once the golden boy of the skies, sat stoically on the witness stand. When he pointed to Hauptmann and said, "That's the man whose voice I heard that night," the courtroom gasped. But even then, no one could explain how Lindbergh could recognize a voice he'd heard only once, shouting through the darkness. The prosecution's evidence was powerful, or at least it looked that way. The ladder wood matched a missing plank from Hauptmann's attic. His handwriting was said to match the ransom notes, and of course, there was the money, thousands of dollars buried in his garage. But beneath the surface, the case was riddled with contradictions. Experts disagreed about the handwriting. Neighbors' testimonies shifted under questioning, and some officers admitted that key evidence, like the ladder, had been handled improperly before analysis. Still, none of it mattered. Public emotion had already delivered the verdict. The press turned Hauptmann into a caricature, the cold foreign monster who had snuffed out the life of America's baby. Cartoons depicted him with devil horns. Newspapers called him the Fiend of Hopewell. Nasu, he was condemned not just for the crime, but for daring to be the villain in the story of a national hero. Even Anne Morrow Lindbergh, broken and silent, became a symbol of saintly suffering. Her image, standing pale beside her husband, appeared in every front page across the country. The tragedy had transcended reality. It had become myth, and myths demand sacrifice. On February 13th, 1935, after 11 weeks of testimony and only 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the inevitable: guilty on all counts. Hauptmann's composure never faltered. "I am not guilty," he said quietly, his accent thick. "I am innocent of this crime." He was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Governor Harold Hauptmann hesitated, ordering a brief review after new evidence surfaced, suggesting police corruption and false testimony. But political pressure and public outrage crushed any chance of reprieve. On April 3rd, 1936, Richard Hauptmann walked to the electric chair in Trenton State Prison. He refused a blindfold, refused a confession, and met death as he had lived, silent, defiant, and forever controversial. The switch was pulled, the lights flickered, and with that, America closed the book on its most haunting crime, or so it thought. The execution of Richard Hauptmann should have ended everything. But for many investigators, journalists, and even some within law enforcement, the case's closure felt too clean, too scripted. Beneath the surface of justice served, a web of corruption, manipulation, and unanswered questions began to unravel. Almost immediately after the trial, new evidence and testimonies started to surface. Evidence that had been ignored, buried, or outright fabricated. The FBI's own internal memos suggested doubts about the ladder analysis. The handwriting experts who had confidently testified later admitted that their comparison methods were flawed, and some had been pressured by prosecutors to stand firm. Even the ransom money told a troubling story. Though $14,000 had been found in Hauptmann's garage, large portions of the bills appeared in circulation after his arrest, suggesting someone else still had access to the rest. The question that haunted investigators: if Hauptmann acted alone, where was the rest of the money? Then there were the whispers of police misconduct. Officers allegedly entered Hauptmann's home before obtaining a warrant, possibly planting or discovering evidence later presented in court. The ladder wood, hailed as the smoking gun, had been moved, cut, and reassembled multiple times before the trial, destroying the chain of custody. In a modern courtroom, it might never have been admissible. Even more disturbing were claims that the crime itself might have been staged or mishandled from the beginning. Some theorized that the baby's fatal injury, the skull fracture, wasn't intentional, but accidental, caused by a fall during the kidnapping attempt. Others suspected the child may have died earlier, and the ransom scheme was an attempt to hide the truth. And then came the rumors involving Charles Lindbergh himself. In later years, whispers emerged suggesting the aviator's obsessive control over the investigation had hindered police work. Lindbergh had refused to let authorities question certain servants, ordered others to remain silent, and even directed search teams personally, a level of interference that, to modern analysts, reeks of desperation and guilt. Had his pride as America's hero clouded his judgment, or was he hiding something deeper? Authors and researchers who revisited the case decades later began connecting dots that prosecutors ignored. Some argued that Hauptmann may have been framed, his immigrant background making him the perfect scapegoat for a furious, grieving nation. Others went further, suggesting Lindbergh's own family had secrets the trial never dared expose. The deeper investigators dug, the more the Lindbergh law, which made kidnapping a federal offense, seemed born not of justice, but of guilt and fear. The story wasn't about one man's crime anymore. It was about a nation's need to preserve its myth, to protect the image of a flawless hero at any cost. And somewhere, buried under lies, politics, and national pride, was the truth about what really happened to baby Charles. In the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh embodied everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves: bravery, genius, self-reliance. When he became the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927, he wasn't just a pilot, he was a symbol of progress. But heroes are human, and beneath the halo of fame, Lindbergh's private life told a different story. Those closest to him described a man of cold discipline, brilliant yet emotionally unreachable. Even his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, wrote in her journals that her husband valued logic over empathy. He measured everything, calories, words, even affection. To the public, this precision was admirable. To those who lived with him, it was chilling. When his son vanished, that control only intensified. Investigators noted how Lindbergh ran the search like a military operation, barking orders at police and reporters alike. He refused to cooperate with federal authorities unless he remained in charge, treating seasoned detectives like subordinates. To many, it was the behavior of a desperate father. To others, it was the arrogance of a man who believed he could outthink tragedy itself. Then came the secrets that time refused to bury. Years later, long after his death, DNA tests revealed that Lindbergh had fathered multiple secret children in Germany and Switzerland during the 1950s. He maintained parallel lives, writing letters to at least 3 women who believed they were his only love. To historians, these revelations recast his obsession with privacy and control in a far darker light. Even before those scandals surfaced, Lindbergh's public image had already cracked. By the late 1930s, he had become an outspoken supporter of isolationism and expressed troubling admiration for Nazi Germany's technological prowess. He accepted a medal from Hermann Göring, Hitler's Air Force commander, and made speeches warning America against fighting the Third Reich. Many of his admirers turned away, unable to reconcile the hero pilot with the man now accused of sympathizing with tyranny. Looking back, it's hard not to see parallels between Lindbergh's rigid worldview and the tragedy that defined his life. He believed the world was governed by order and hierarchy, that brilliance and discipline could overcome chaos. But when chaos came for his son, it shattered everything he believed in. Some investigators and biographers have even speculated that Lindbergh's obsessive secrecy after the kidnapping, his refusal to allow a full forensic investigation of the nursery, his insistence on controlling witnesses, may have cost the case its truth. Perhaps unintentionally, he became the architect of the very mystery that haunted him. By the end of his life, Charles Lindbergh was a man divided, hero and pariah, father and symbol, saint and sinner. He had conquered the sky, but lost everything on the ground. And for many, the real tragedy of the Lindbergh case was that the man who defined American greatness could never escape his own shadows. Long before Netflix podcasts or 24-hour news, there was the Lindbergh case, and it changed the way America consumed tragedy. The kidnapping of America's baby didn't just break hearts, it rewired the relationship between crime, media, and fame. In 1932, newspapers were the nation's lifeblood. Radio was still young, photography primitive, but when the story broke, editors knew they had gold. Front pages screamed with headlines in bold black ink, "Baby of hero flyer stolen from crib." Within hours, newspapers across the world carried the same photo, a smiling blonde toddler in a sailor suit. For weeks, nothing else mattered. Reporters camped outside the Lindbergh home, hiding in trees, bribing servants, sneaking into the courtroom. Some fabricated tips just to stay relevant. Others broke laws, intercepting letters meant for investigators. It was chaos disguised as journalism, and the public devoured every word. The tragedy became entertainment. Women wore black ribbons for the baby. Souvenir stands sold replica ladders. People mailed money to the Lindberghs, convinced they could buy justice. Hollywood began developing films before the case was even solved. It was America's first crime of the century, not because of its brutality, but because it unfolded in real time, across every headline and living room. The line between fact and spectacle disappeared. Every sob, every rumor, every accusation became part of the narrative. When Hauptmann went on trial 3 years later, that obsession metastasized into something bigger. Radio broadcasts carried live commentary. Artists sketched every courtroom tear. For the first time, a criminal case became a shared emotional experience, uniting millions in outrage and curiosity. And in that frenzy, something new was born, the template for modern true crime. The Lindbergh case created the playbook. The tragic innocence of the victim, the celebrity connection, the mysterious clues, the public's hunger for closure, no matter the cost. Decades later, the same formula would echo through names like JonBenet Ramsey, O.J. Simpson, and Madeleine McCann, stories that turned private grief into public obsession. But Lindbergh's case was the prototype, the moment America learned that crime could be currency. It also birthed a darker consequence. The Lindbergh's trauma inspired lawmakers to create the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping a federal crime punishable by death. It gave the FBI new power and prestige, cementing its role as the nation's ultimate investigative force. In short, one tragedy reshaped the justice system and the media machine that still feeds on human pain. When the cameras finally turned away, the Lindberghs withdrew from public life, forever marked by the attention they once courted. The nation moved on, but something had shifted. America had tasted its first true crime spectacle, and it would never stop craving more. Nearly a century has passed since that cold March night in 1932, but the shadow of the Lindbergh kidnapping still lingers over American history, not just as a crime, but as a mirror of its time. The tragedy gave birth to a new kind of law, a new kind of media, and a new kind of myth, one that blurred the boundaries between justice and vengeance, truth and theater. It changed the way America investigated, prosecuted, and even remembered crime. The Lindbergh Law, signed by President Herbert Hoover in 1932, made kidnapping across state lines a federal offense. It armed the FBI with the authority to pursue criminals nationwide and imposed the death penalty in cases where the victim was harmed. The law's intent was noble, to prevent another tragedy like this one, but it also symbolized something darker, America's obsession with control through punishment. Yet, even as the government celebrated its new power, cracks remained. In the decades that followed, forensic experts, historians, and independent investigators kept reopening the Lindbergh case, convinced that something had gone wrong, that the wrong man had died. The more they searched, the stranger the story became. Documents revealed missing evidence, coerced witnesses, and investigators who ignored leads pointing to other suspects. One FBI memo even questioned whether the child might have died accidentally and the kidnapping been a cover-up gone too far. Others fixated on Lindbergh himself, his rigid control of the investigation, his decision to personally handle the ransom exchange, his insistence that police keep certain information secret. To some, these were the actions of a desperate father. To others, they were signs of a man manipulating the narrative, a man who, in trying to save his image, may have buried the truth along with his child. Even the location where the body was found remains symbolic, not far from the house, as if fate or guilt refused to let the family escape its own tragedy. Over the years, believers, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists have argued endlessly about the ladder, the handwriting, the ransom, and the identity of the real culprit. But perhaps that's the true legacy of this story. Its mystery endures because America needs it to. The Lindbergh kidnapping wasn't just about the death of a child. It was the death of innocence, the moment a country realized that even its heroes could not escape the cruelty of the world. It gave rise to the age of the media circus, of televised trials and sensational headlines, where private sorrow became public spectacle. And through it all, one small face, the face of Charles Lindbergh Jr., still stares from faded photographs, a haunting reminder that beneath every legend lies a human story, and beneath every hero, a ghost. Every great mystery ends the same way, with a question that refuses to die. And in the case of Charles Lindbergh Jr., that question still echoes through nearly a century of investigation, obsession, and myth. What really happened that night in Hopewell? The facts are simple, too simple. A baby vanished from his crib. A ransom was paid. A child was found dead. A man was executed. But between those points lies a maze of contradictions, missing hours, and motives lost to history. Some experts believe the answer lies in accident, not murder. The ladder, crudely built and unsteady, could have splintered under the kidnapper's weight. A fall from the second-story window would explain the fatal skull fracture found on the child's remains. Perhaps the perpetrator panicked, buried the body, and turned the tragedy into a ransom scheme. If that's true, the killing wasn't calculated. It was chaos disguised as conspiracy. Others, however, see something more sinister. The precision of the ransom letters, the symbolic markings, and the insider knowledge of Lindbergh's home all suggest an inside job. Some pointed fingers at the household staff, others at organized crime. But a few dared to whisper the unthinkable, that Charles Lindbergh himself might have staged, or at least controlled, the aftermath to protect his reputation. There is no proof, only inconsistencies, only silence. Then there's the haunting possibility that more than one person was involved. Several witnesses described two figures near the estate that night, one tall, one shorter, possibly carrying something wrapped in cloth. Could Hauptmann have been just a courier, a middleman in a larger operation that vanished once the spotlight burned too bright? To this day, no evidence rules it out. Modern technology has tried to pierce the mystery. Forensic reanalysis of the ransom notes, DNA traces from the ladder, even digital voice reconstructions have all been attempted. Yet none have revealed the definitive truth. The case remains officially closed, but emotionally open. The Lindbergh home in Hopewell still stands, preserved like a time capsule. Visitors say that at dusk, when the light fades through the nursery window, the house feels unnervingly alive, as if the past is still pacing its halls. A reminder that fame cannot protect against fate, and that even the purest legends leave shadows. In the end, perhaps the truth isn't hidden. It's simply human, a mix of grief, pride, and error. A desperate act that spiraled into history's most famous crime. The ladder, the note, the gold certificates, all artifacts of a tragedy too heavy for one nation to carry, yet impossible to let go. And as long as the world seeks answers in the dark, the ghost of the Lindbergh baby will never stop crying out for truth. The Lindbergh case changed everything: law, media, justice, and the very idea of heroism. It reminds us that behind every great story lies a fragile truth waiting to be uncovered. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true investigations into the mysteries that shaped our world. Share this video and let history echo once more. Because the truth isn't buried, it's waiting to be found. And sometimes the real mystery isn't what happened, but why we still need to know.